People might note that I've tinkered with the title of the presentation slightly, largely due to events that have happened since we came up with the title. I'm seeing a few familiar faces in the participants, so hello everyone who knows me. And hello to those who don't. Hello, I'm Dan Manville from the Law Centre. I'm the Welfare Bench Supervisor here. Thank you for coming to our community event today. We'll be looking at very recent developments in what we know about the migration to universal credit, with a bit of history and where it's come from, so forth and so on. I've said to the majority of you, I'm happy to take questions as we go along, stick them in the chat, and Kian, my right-hand man who's hiding somewhere in that list of screens, will bring them to my attention as we come along. How do I make it work? So what we're going to be discussing is a brief overview of universal credit, the problems that people have claiming it, the rollout, and where to go for more information and assistance, i.e. ring Dan or your local welfare rights service. But before we get into the crux of it, I always like to show people this slide, because when universal credit was first envisaged back in 2013, a lot of us thought it might be a really good idea. And this slide illustrates why. Back in 2015, I found what turned out to be my first ever Windrush case, and I wanted to go and have a look at the residency conditions for supplementary benefit as it was in 1984. And I went and I dug out all the legislation and all the guidance for welfare benefits as they stood in 1984. And that gives you that left-hand slide. But by 2015, the pile of books was that high because there've been so many sticking plasters that the situation has just become intolerable to a degree. It's very expensive on advice centres, very complicated for advisors who are expert in the field, never mind Joe Public on the ground who's got to try and get their head around it. So we cheered the thought of a reforming project. But oh, how wrong we were. We might have known, being as it was the Tories, but there we go. So what is it? We probably mostly know this, but let's rattle through these slides anyway. It's a new benefit. It's only for working age claimants, and it's a subsistence benefit that just pays for your daily living. And there's often a tale behind these slides. And that couple on the right-hand side are looking so pleased with themselves because they're not going to have to claim universal credit. Nothing changes for pensioners. They're protected thanks to the fact that you'll usually vote for the reformers. Again, it's a simplification. Whether or not it makes work pay is a moot point since all the changes, and that's one of the things we'll be coming back to. And one of the problems that we might see in the forthcoming campaign we're going to see. And one of the big changes is that it's claimed by anyone, whether they're in work or out of work, under the legacy schemes, so income support, employment and support loans, JSA. If your circumstances changed, you hit a cliff edge and you had to make a new claim for benefit. But with universal credit, it's all in one package. And instead of having to make a new claim, the requirements you have to fulfill to continue to claim universal credit change. So someone being found fit for work might suddenly find that they're required to go in for lots of interviews at the job centre, or someone who's become a carer might suddenly stop having to fulfill those obligations. I think we all know by now that it's assessed and paid monthly. Couples enter the system separately, but then are joined and are assessed in a benefit unit. And in most circumstances, just like the legacy schemes, if you've got capital over £16,000, then you're not entitled. Although there is a break for that, for people migrating from tax credits, people coming into the system from tax credits, because tax credits didn't assess people's capital. There is a disregard for the first 12 months, but that's an issue there to satisfy some of the benefit nerds in there. And usually you manage it online, and I wanted to have a look at that online claim process, just for people who've not seen a UC claim to have an idea, and I'll be referring back to this a little bit further down my presentation. So when you make your claim for universal credit, you fill out the form, you hit the big green submit button, you get a universal credit account, and this is what it looks like. We've got a home page where we can do things like tell people about a change, add a note to the journal that we'll come back to, and a to-do list where instructions from the various minions of Job Centre Plus are supposed to be communicated to the claimant. In practice, that didn't always happen. That doesn't always happen, and I don't know whether there are moves to rectify that within Job Centre Plus. I do hope so, but I think it might be a big ask for the people building the computer systems. Then you've got your to-do list, and this is what Job Centre Plus are telling you that you need to do. And once you've done it, it should be marked as done, but in practice there are problems with that we will come back to as we go through. And then we've got the journal, and this is where the claimant can communicate with Job Centre Plus. The to-do list is from Job Centre Plus to the claimant, and then the journal is for the claimant to contact them. And I'm just checking my next slide to see whether or not I need to bring it in. And there is an issue that I've seen time and again with this journal stroke change of circumstances business. You'll remember on the home page there, we've got report to change of circumstances. Whereas on the journal, the claimant can put messages on there to discuss things with Job Centre Plus. Now, in the language that people are using with universal credit, when someone has a change, frequently they're told, tell us about it on your journal. So people put a message in there, they add a journal entry through that big green button and say, my Uncle Fred's just been awarded attendance allowance and I'm looking after him, and nothing changes. Now that should be a trigger for extra money in some circumstances, a change of work related requirements, and someone thinks that they've rightly communicated that properly to Job Centre Plus. But what they should have done is report a change of circumstances, and that triggers the automatic changes. And this is a digital system. It's all about the computer working it out sometimes anyway, and I'll come to that in a minute. But all too often we're seeing changes of circumstances notified via this journal rather than via the change of circumstances module. And it's important when we're advising people to identify what's a change of circumstances, such as becoming ill, notifying sick notes, and what's just a journal entry, such as you've not paid me enough money, will you reconsider it please? That distinction's often failing. And so to these stumbling blocks, there's a few people. Oh, well, first and foremost, can we remember who is in the image? Because again, this is an image with a tail. I train lots of students and they're too young to recognize Carol Beer there. They don't remember the computer says no. But hopefully there's a few more wrinkly people in here who will get the line. Either way, stumbling blocks. Job Centre Plus won't speak to advisors unless we jump through a lot of hoops. The explicit consent policy gives the people answering the phone at Job Centre Plus an excuse to say, sorry, we don't know the answer to your question. We're not going to make any inquiries. There's something wrong with the entry on the journal. And I certainly find that quite a big barrier to communicating with Job Centre Plus, because all too often the only avenue to communicate with them is by phone, and they'll just block you completely. There's been a big debate about whether or not advisors can access people's journals, and generally we're very squeamish about doing so unless we've got the claimant there. So this explicit consent process, where they can just use it as an excuse to speak to you, is a bit of a problem. And now we move to some of the concerns, and some of these issues were switched off early on during the pandemic, but we fear that they might come back. So someone makes the claim, fills out the big green, presses the big green submit button. A case manager at Job Centre Plus looks at the claim and says, we need to see X, Y, and Z from you. And they put a message up saying, please send us X, Y, and Z. And if that X, Y, and Z wasn't provided within 14 days, the claim would automatically close down. And in my experience, where those requirements were put on early in the claim is where the major barriers were to people claiming universal credit. I was working in social services. I was part of the appointeeship team for many years in the early days of universal credit, and often if a message goes up on your to-do list, I think this is on here somewhere, yeah, if a message goes up on the to-do list, you're supposed to get an email that says you've got something to do, so get it done. But those emails didn't crystallize, and I'm pretty sure that that message, be it via email or be it via text message, you get an option to complete those to-do lists. A person needs to press that button to send that message. And if the phone rings at the wrong time and that button doesn't get pressed, then you've got a clock ticking on the claim closing down automatically, and you might not know about it because that to-do's not being put in the to-do list. Further down the list, we've got the fact that, or have I removed it? We've got messages. Another issue, yeah, there we go. Another issue with the to-dos is there's a dialogue box with them saying, what have you done about completing this? And if you say, well, I've asked X about Y and he's going to get back to me next week, certainly 2 years ago, that would mark the to-do as to done. But the clock's still ticking on that 14 days because the information hasn't been provided, and then the claim automatically closes down. There's lots of holes in that to-do list. And when we end up advising people who've had to claim universal credit or who've chosen to claim universal credit, one of the most important things we can say when we're with them is there anything to do on your to-do list? Just to keep people appraised of that. Now, one of the important to-dos that gets posted is the claimant commitment. The claimant commitment, people might remember the old job seekers agreements where you agreed to apply for 2 jobs a week in your given sectors. These days, benefit as a right is no longer a concept in universal credit. This is a privilege. It's a contract between the claimant and the taxpayer. And if the claimant doesn't keep up their commitments, then, or doesn't agree to the commitments, then again, they'll either face a sanction, or if they don't agree to the commitments, a closure. And those claimant commitments are automatically refreshed on the system. Certainly when I was managing a lot of universal credit claims, we thought it was every 3 months, but then it started happening quite randomly that people would get a new claimant commitment posted to the system, and then it's only a 7-day clock. And if you don't agree to it within 7 days, you're potentially facing a claim closure again, and all the mucking about that goes with that. At the moment, we've got lots of people who don't know what they're doing manning the phones. So even if you can see that there's a problem, ring them up, get through explicit consent. They'll tell you what you want to hear rather than telling you the actual root of the problem. And often people like me need to do a bit of detective work to get behind what your claimant's been told. And one of the big difficulties here is the Chinese whispers between the people communicating to the claimant and the claimant communicating to you, because often what comes through isn't true. And you end up, despite the fact that you don't want to, needing to go back to Job Centre Plus, making your own inquiries just to identify what's actually going on. I needn't mention housing costs verification. once these claims are closed, then you've not got access to that journal anymore, which means you've got to get on the phone to them, often with your client on the line, just to find out what's going on. And I've already discussed that often claimants will be advised to notify changes via the journal rather than notifying it as a change of circumstances. As I say, during the lockdown, and it's still the case now, I believe, those automatic claim closures weren't happening. Job Centre Plus issued statistics at some point showing that they had universal credit claims that were still live. I think the longest one was 10 weeks after it had been made. So there were still to-dos that needed doing, and that 14-day issue to close claims down hadn't been implemented, and it was clear to me, at least, that this automatic claim closure process had been a problem and might soon become a problem again. Now, people will be told your claim's closed, you've got to make a new claim, and the quickest way of sorting out claim closures is to make that new claim, because then you've got a journal to communicate on. You probably need to make a new claim anyway to secure someone's entitlement, but yeah, you can spend hours on the phone trying to find out what's gone on, or you can get a new claim, open up a new channel of communication with Job Centre Plus and speed things along. Now, in the good old days, although this is rectified now, you'd just get a message saying sorry, your claim's closed, make a new claim. And that didn't reflect the fact that the claim closure is actually a decision that you weren't entitled to universal credit. People weren't told you've got a right to challenge this. They were just told, sorry, do it again. But there was case law from the upper tribunal that suggested that where that happened, there was a direct right of appeal that interrupted the mandatory reconsideration requirement. And DWP got the message, and these days, the last couple of claim closures I've seen have said, we've closed your claim, you can appeal against this decision. I'd be interested to hear whether or not anyone's seen different recently while I'm here. Silence says otherwise, so I'll just motor on. Now, often there are arguments that the claim shouldn't have been closed. Did they get the message? Was the good cause for them not to do what they were doing? And communication is a bit lax these days with Job Centre Plus. You might put a message on your journal and not get a reply within a week. So would that be good cause for failing to do what has led to the claim being closed? Further down the line, was it an unreasonable requirement? In cases I saw, they were asking for documents that simply didn't exist, and then the claim's closing after 14 days. And have they applied the right time limit? Now, we've already said that universal credit is assessed monthly. And after the first month of the claim, a month into the claim being made, the assessment period closes. Now, if there were outstanding to-dos, with the time limit continuing past the end of the assessment period had passed and the claim will close down anyway. Again, I don't know how much of this is fixed since the lockdown. I worry that all these sharp edges in universal credit could suddenly pop back up. They were there by design. They switched them off when they could, and they switched them off pretty darn quick, so they could switch them on again. One thing that's concerned me is I've started seeing sanction decisions again. So obviously they're thinking about making it a bit sharp. Now, whatever happens, be it a claim closure or be it a sanction decision or anything else, they will tell you that there's a 1 month deadline to challenge the decision. They'll tell you you've got a month to seek mandatory reconsideration. But in practice, thanks to a crafty bit of case law, that month will extend by a further year. Excuse me for a sec. So if you see someone and they've had problems with universal credit, it's worth backtracking over a year to see where the problems have arisen, because people will have claims that are stopping and starting, and each time there's a claim closure, you can just tell them to reconsider it. And in practice, the will guidance came out telling them to consider any reconsiderations decisions that were made within to reconsider any decisions that were made within 13 months. And they do seem to be doing that without any problem. So don't ask them to reconsider, tell them to reconsider, and bear in mind that you've got a year to do it, and that pulls it back onto the appeal track then. Just be conscious that the appeal's got to be made within a year. But in practice, hopefully people who aren't used to making a bit of a legal argument will be ringing us up if they've got a really late reconsideration request to see what to do. With particularly late ones, more than 6 or 7 months, you probably need one of the experts in the room to advise you on progress from there. But yes, I think what I'm really concerned about going forward with what we're about to start talking about might lead to all these sharp edges being switched on, and certainly we've seen them getting a bit nasty with people just recently. Come on then, move. So how were they going to do it? There was lots of talk of a managed migration, past tense. They were talking about moving 10,000 people in Harrogate over from legacy benefits to universal credit. Now, if anyone's been to Harrogate, Harrogate's a leafy and affluent place. You Google it, there are times when it's come out as the best place to live in the UK. And I was sceptical about this when they announced Harrogate as a platform, so I went off looking at DWP statistics, and there were 2,760 people on ESA, job seekers allowance and income support. Estimates were, when they rounded up, that altogether, including housing benefit and tax credits, there were between 3,000 and 5,000 people in Harrogate who could have been part of this project. And what they proposed was being all nicey-nicey to people and saying, why don't you fancy joining universal credit instead? In practice, they hardly got anybody to join before everything changed. Now, some of us will know that there were people who couldn't claim universal credit because they were entitled to the severe disability protection. And as part of the introduction of the managed migration, the severe disability premium gateway was stopped, and everybody could claim universal credit from the beginning of this year. Now, I meant to put this bit in bold, this next bit in bold, as a reminder to myself, but I've caught myself. For people who are part of the managed migration from legacy benefits to universal credit, if they're part of the managed migration, then they get transitional protection. The people who were worse off on universal credit get a bit of a top up to make sure that they don't lose out any money when they move across to universal credit. The idea was, as part of this managed migration, that nobody would lose out initially, and it would be tailored in over a year or two. As the universal credit rate increased, that transitional amount would decrease until things evened up. And what they suggested was writing to people, giving them 3 months to claim, making lots of noise saying, why don't you claim universal credit? And during this managed migration process, during the trial, they promised that they wouldn't stop anyone's benefits. The law said that they could, but they said, oh no, we're not going to stop anyone's money. We'll have a look at why on the next slide. The benefits of the managed migration, some of them have seeped into the usual transition as well. We've got a 2-week run-on of income support, ESA or JSA. Now, if someone's getting a legacy benefit, including a subsistence benefit, then they'll get an extra fortnight as they move in onto universal credit, and that mitigates some of the first effects of the transition. People who are self-employed might face an assumption that they're earning 30 times the national minimum wage. This is called the minimum income floor. And during the managed migration, they would just get clobbered by that at the outset. Self-employed people are particularly hard hit by this process. Although the majority of self-employed people seem to have had a change of circumstances that's mitigated that, but we'll come to that further on. Now, there is a discretionary hardship fund built into this managed migration. I did a freedom of information request to find out what had happened to that discretionary hardship fund, and they directed me to guidance about discretionary housing payments for housing benefit and universal credit housing costs. They very firmly ducked that question, but they did legislate for a separate hardship fund. And as I mentioned earlier on, people coming in from tax credits who've got money in the bank, any capital over £16,000 would be disregarded for 12 years. So that was the managed migration. Even with some mitigation, transitional protection, plenty of notice to claim, people were generally a bit concerned about what was going on. Because some of us have been in the game long enough to know the track record of transferring people to benefits. Some of us will remember what happened in 2002 when they introduced tax credits. Now, when they introduced child tax credit in 2002, they said at some point in the future, we will require everyone who's getting the child dependency additions on the predecessor benefits. So people who were getting money for the kids on income support, money for the kids on job seekers allowance, ESA didn't exist at the time. Then eventually they were going to move those people to claiming child tax credit instead of receiving the money on income support. And it got to about 2004 when they were initially intending to do it. And then they started issuing amending provisions. Every year we'd get a provision saying, now we'll do it next year. Now we'll do it next year. And eventually all the children who the benefit was being claimed for had grown up and they gave up. They never had the nerve to transfer people onto tax credits because of all the hoo-ha about people who just needed to claim them. With the tax credit system, they built a computer system that could stop people's money and not notify anybody about it. So people at HMRC didn't know. There wasn't a letter that gets sent out to the claimant. The first thing people knew that there'd been a problem was when the money wasn't in the bank, and that caused a lot of people a headache. It wasn't very nice. Now, the next conversion was incapacity benefit to employment and support allowance, and that was supposed to be conducted between 2011 and 2014. Now, I've not seen one of my colleagues from Trafford joining this meeting, but I know there are still people in Greater Manchester who are in receipt of incapacity benefit, and they promised they would have this process complete by 2014 when they introduced, well, originally it said 2016, but they accelerated the process. Again, DLA to PIP, we're probably, anyone who's doing PIP forms is probably still seeing people who are migrating from disability living allowance. They said it would stop, it would be finished by 2017. But it's still going on. The government's no good at moving people from one benefit system to another. So they've got cold feet. They suggested this managed migration scheme that tried to take some of the sting out of it, but advisors such as myself and some of the other people in the room were very nervous about what was going to happen thanks to this law. But then the spanner in the room, the spanner in the works was the pandemic. And I'm not sure whether those numbers are big enough to see. They are on my big screen there, but as you can see, between February and May 2020, 2.5 million people who weren't expected to claim universal credit claimed universal credit. And everyone said that's not 10,000 people in Harrogate, and a lot of people asked the question about what was happening next. Now, other than the managed migration, the other avenue for people moving into universal credit was what they called natural migration. Since 2013 in some areas, certainly since 2017 in Greater Manchester, anyone who was on legacy, but for some reason those legacy benefits stopped, or they had to make a new claim for, then they would have to make a new claim for universal credit instead of claiming housing benefit or income support. And we called this the natural migrate. Well, they called it the natural migration. There was lots of language about a relevant change of circumstances that I need, that I could probably delete these days. There are some cases, especially people receiving housing benefit, where the difference between needing to make a new claim for universal credit and needing to claim housing benefit got blurred, because often a change of circumstances for housing benefit isn't a relevant change of circumstances. It doesn't require a new claim for benefit to be made. Yet a lot of people, certainly up here, were notified that they would need to claim universal credit instead of just notifying a change of circumstances for housing benefit. Whether or not the game having changed so thoroughly since the pandemic bit has changed that, I don't know, but we need to be alive to it just in case, because as we saw in the title, don't claim universal credit yet unless we have to. And the reason for that is this here. Can I point to it on my cursor? There's no transitional protection if you naturally migrate. There are a cohort of people who will lose out a significant amount of money, and they're the people who are £10 a week is a lot of money. And if they migrate naturally, they'll just lose that, because there isn't transitional protection written into the managed migration scheme. So we're post-pandemic. The natural migration, the managed migration, seems to have been thrown into the long grass, and everybody was asking, what happens next, really? In August, pretty much out of the blue, DWP tendered for some organisations to say, what are we going to do about moving people across from legacy benefits to universal credit? And a lot of people had claimed UC who probably needed to. They're more likely to be the tax credits claimants whose work stopped. A lot of people will have been mistakenly advised to claim UC when they didn't, because it was just a tax credits change of circumstances, but that's by the by. We were all wondering, with a lot of the UC caseload having moved across, what was going to happen next, and this was the first sign that something was coming. And as you'll see, can you tell? Yeah, this was published and a fortnight later it closed. We knew that they were clearly in a rush to do something about this, and they tendered and implemented quite quickly, by the looks of it, some scheme to move all the people who were on legacy benefits over across to universal credit. Now, I've not put the link in. It's quite difficult to put a coherent link to the government stats in, but there are still nearly 1.6 million people in receipt of income-related employment and support allowance. There are only 40,000 people on income support, and they'll all be long-term carers by now. And what I'm trying to say is there's a substantial we don't know how many people are still on tax credits, but there is still a substantial cohort, and in my estimation, probably more than a couple of million people who are on legacy benefits. And the government wants to try and do something about it. They've got a scheme in place, they've got the managed migration in place, so they could try and do it as painlessly as possible for people. But this tender had me and certainly a few of us in the sphere wondering whether or not something else was going to happen. And we started hearing rumblings from the partnership managers, the interface between ourselves as advisors and Job Centre Plus as the enemy, that something was going to change. There was lots of talk about consultations. How are we going to do it? We're going to try and push people into moving across to universal credit themselves. We were going to push them to naturally migrate. And as I've already said, if they naturally migrate, a lot more people will lose out than if the managed migration is conducted properly. And the resulting campaign went live on Tuesday while I was preparing these slides, which really quite pleased me. What we're going to see, certainly in one way, what we're going to see in the coming weeks is a big push from universal credit to persuade everybody who's not in the know to claim it anyway. This website was circulated via advisor groups on Tuesday. We'll probably see it in the press. We'll probably see friendly little articles in the local media, on the telly. All the propaganda channels are going to start talking about how much better you'll be on universal credit. It probably won't mention money, because there are still a significant cohort of people who will be worse off. It'll talk about how easy it is to manage and how much support people will get if they're self-employed or in part-time work to increase their hours. It probably won't mention that if you don't do your damnedest to find more work or better paid work, they'll sanction you. It probably won't mention that if you're self-employed, they'll probably assume an income that will wipe out most of your universal credit entitlement before you even start getting paid. They're just going to start this well, they've already started this campaign to try and persuade people to claim UC. So really, I said to Kian, who's put the organisation for this together, that we probably couldn't have timed this better, because now is to get the message out through all our channels that noise is going to start happening about people claiming universal credit, but a lot of people will be worse off. The thing is, not all of them will be. There are people who will be better off claiming universal credit, and however much it sticks in my craw, I do tell some people that that's the case. Particularly, and this is easy to illustrate on a slide, people who are just in the support group on employment and support allowance, and you can see the numbers there. A single person who's in the support group still getting income related employment and support allowance gets £131.30 a week. But the money, because they're in the support group, the limited capability for work-related activity element, what a gobful that is nearly double the equivalent money in income-related employment and support allowance. So 23 quid a week to people whose total income is 130 quid a week is a lot of money. You know, that's a big difference to someone's weekly spend. It's more than a week's shopping for a single person, and that's how much of a difference there is for people moving on to UC if they're in the support group and unemployment and support allowance. Most people, most people will be a sniff better off. So there's some people we might want to say, you're better off claiming UC. For the less experienced amongst us, there's always opportunity to either check a benefit entitlement calculator or speak to one of the experts in this room to check whether or not it's a good move. There are another cohort of people that I spent ages trying to illustrate this on a slide. Some people will know Gareth Morgan, and I tried borrowing his slides from one of the conventions to illustrate the cohort of people, the other cohort of people that will benefit, but I don't think I could put it into an easily digestible format. So there are some people who've either got children or they've got limited capability for work, who are entitled to a work allowance where they're earning, and Job Centre Plus will let them keep a bit of the wages. Now, if those people are getting help with the rent, then the amount they can keep is £293 a month. Whereas if they're not getting help with the rent, so they're living with the parents or they're paying a mortgage, then they get to keep the first £515 a month. So what we end up with here is, as well as the people in the support group, there are a cohort of people with relatively low earnings, probably working less than 16 hours a week in most circumstances, with a work allowance that means that they're in a better position claiming universal credit than they were claiming in receipt of tax credits, if they were entitled to tax credits at all. But just to illustrate, that is a fiendish calculation. You need to know the rules about exempt work for employment and support allowance. You need to be able to weigh the taper rates of tax credits against the taper weights of universal credit. You might be able to translate it into a benefit calculator, but most benefit calculators said this is just an educated guess reliant on the information that you put into it, and just putting the right enough information into a benefit calculator requires a bit of knowledge that a lot of people don't have. So my message, unless people are in the support group on employment and support allowance, is get advice, check a calculator and check it twice before advising anybody who might benefit from this to claim universal credit. The government, as I said, the government's going to be messaging left, right and centre to try and persuade people to do this now. They don't want to pay that transitional protection out. The more people that move during this campaign, the more it will save them in the longer term. So yeah, messaging all our channels. Government's telling us to claim UC, think twice, seek advice where you can. Hence the change in the presentation title at the beginning, because we didn't know that campaign was going to happen. So just going to those people who it might be in, we've identified that it is in their interests to make a claim. We'd like to think that the Department for Work and Pensions will write to them with one of these migration notices saying you're going to have to claim universal credit within 3 months, but in practice that's not going to happen this time around. The managed migration, it's not history, it's still in the rule book, but they really don't want to do it. We've already said people could claim it online. People who are IT savvy, even slightly, claim universal credit into Google. I think it's quite a straightforward process, and I always tell people, if you can run a Facebook account, you can probably run a universal credit account. The fundament is very similar, but there are a lot of people who can't do that. I was looking at figures from the Ministry of Justice this morning about something different that said that 18% of people in the community are digitally excluded. They'll struggle to run a Facebook account and they'll struggle to claim universal credit. In practice, in the advice agencies that we're working in, that figure is going to be much higher. And so we've got Citizens Advice Help to Claim that have been, Citizens Advice have been contracted to provide services to help those vulnerable people make the claims. They don't help them manage it, but they will help them to get it in and see them as far as the first payment. And I'm open to objections on this point from some of the advisors that I know are in here, but I think Citizens Advice Help to Claim are actually pretty handy. I've had some conversations with some high-level people there about more objectionable things that might have happened, and they've gone out of the way to rectify it. I know that they've got back office communications with Job Centre Plus. So once the wrangling that happens, once you've pressed the big green submit button, doesn't happen, and negotiations are made to get people through appointments, all that kind of business. They've got interpreters on tap. Generally, Help to Claim, I think, are probably doing quite a good job of it.
I think with the Help to Claim, I'm interrupting here, sorry.
If you missed a bit, say feel free to interrupt.
Yeah,
then feel free to interrupt.
I think that they probably generally do a very good job of setting the claim up in the right kind of way for that person's needs. What they may not always do is check whether someone's actually going to get more in universal credit if they're already getting legacy benefits. And I think
that's a fair point.
It depends on which citizens' advice it is, and who they've put on that service. And some know for a fact put on very good, very experienced advice, and others don't.
No, it wouldn't surprise me at all. And there's another problem with Help to Claim that I'm going to come on to on my next slide.
And the other thing I was going to say was that I think that the telephone claim, to my mind, although you can see there's a need for it on its own, is really unsatisfactory.
I agree
because the claimant can't see anything and they spend forever getting through on the phone line. I did have a client recently, and I think she's not the first, and she did request the payment statements, and then that didn't come, and then she had to ring them again to get the payment statements. And I think it must have taken something like 4 to 6 weeks.
And the other thing with the other problem with the telephone claim is because it's much like Facebook. You need to give the universal credit account an email address, and that email address has got to be unique to the user. But 3 months down the line, when they've forgotten the security questions, they can't speak to universal credit on the phone. They need to reset the credentials via the email address, but they've not got access to the email address. So then you've got the old rigmarole of making a new claim and making sure you can speak to someone who knows the process to align the new claim payment schedule to the old claim payment schedule. And I wouldn't trust all those new entrants on the phone to do that. I'd be straight on to partnerships, and I doubt a lot of the people on this session, and I don't know how many there is now. Let's have a look. 44. I doubt a lot of people on this session will have an open dialogue with the partnerships team that can sort that out. Telephone claims, Help to Claim. We'll get to the other problem with Help to Claim. So, right, one way or another, once you've pressed the big green submit button, they will ask you to verify your identification. If you've got photo ID, you can do it on the machine. A lot of people haven't, in which case universal credit will contact you and do a biographical check. We might have heard recently that in the early stages of the lockdown, they didn't do that biographical check. They put some claims, 900,000 claims, into payment without adequate ID verification. And just recently, they've gone back and retrospectively done ID checks for people. Now, how they went about it was they sent someone a text message on the last known number, or sent them an email to the email address on the claim saying, we're going to ring you in 2 hours to check your ID and do an interview with you. And they would try that 3 times, and if they couldn't contact the claimant on that 2-hour notice, then what's happened is that the claim stopped completely, and they've notified the claimant of all the universal credit they were paid since last year being an overpayment, and can we have our money back, please? Now, that's one of the reasons I think that all the claim closures that caused so many people so many problems just before the lockdown may well be on the horizon now. They've reported that they stopped 90,000 claims of the 900. Well, it was 11% of around 900,000 claims that they've reportedly stopped. And I saw a surge coming in through Manchester of people whose money had just stopped. And it's not your average universal credit claimant who was in a rush. It's your really vulnerable people. It's your street homeless people. It's your people with severe mental health difficulties, the people who will forget the credentials, the people who won't answer the phone. They're all the people who've been clobbered by this. Unfortunately, we've got good reactive services in Manchester where the noise has been coming from, that we've been able to mop it up quite proactively. But all the same, on a whim, they stopped 90,000 people's money a couple of weeks ago. And yeah, I think we're in for trouble with this natural migration thing. I think we're going to see claims stopping again. So we know what to do. And as I say, what we need to do is get a new claim in, seek reconsideration. And if those claim closures are going to be switched on again, then we've got to remember that after the initial interview, someone will have 7 days to log in or contact Universal Credit and agree the claimant commitment. Those expert advisors amongst us will know that not everybody needs to agree to a claimant commitment, and hopefully we'll either be negotiating on their behalf or advising their advocates how to negotiate on their behalf to prevent that claimant commitment being generated. We've already said there's a 1-month assessment period to give DWP opportunity to rumble round, do everything that they need to do and calculate how much universal credit someone is entitled to. All of that is not good, which we'll be coming to next. Once that month's up, you get a week, then you get paid. And that was the legendary 5-week wait that we heard so much about that caused so many politicians so much headache. But as people will remember, these days we've got a 14-day run-on of legacy benefits. You get an extra fortnight's money after you've made your universal credit, which does a lot for the people who most need it to mitigate that 5-week wait. Because the other mitigation that they put in for that 5-week wait was advance payments. And this is the other problem with help to claim. We've got people in the law centre who've worked at 2 or 3 bureaus, and often help to claim will encourage people to take out the maximum advance payment that they can. Now we can see this is based on Manchester numbers. When the 1-bed LHA is the amount of rent that someone will get for a 1-bedroom flat in central Manchester. The standard allowance is how much that person will get if they're not disabled or a carer. That's the equivalent of the 73 quid a week that we all know and love, and it's pegged to that figure. So that's £923.19. Now these days, lovingly, they will repay it over 2 years instead of 1. Historically, these were recovered over a year, but now they've extended that period. And you might think reducing it to just over 10% of the standard allowance is a kind thing to do. But I'm not so sure, because universal credit, as well as being supposedly a subsistence benefit that's there to help people with the day-to-day expenses, it's a debt collection agency. And we can see, as well as an advance payment that might be made, anyone who's got rent arrears with a social landlord will end up paying them back at a 20% rate. And I've just noticed that I didn't update that when I ran through these slides on Tuesday. It's a little bit less than that. But all the same, it's a big chunk. They've written to your landlord. Hello?
We've just had another comment come in that you might like to go off on tangent. So another post-pandemic problem is with people who've never had a visual test at the start of the claim, and they're now being told that they don't have the right to reside and that all benefits are overpaid and recoverable.
I've seen one instance of that. Well, I've seen 2 instances of that where they made a mistake about the HRT. I didn't realise that they were going back over HRT decisions as well. Where was that, can I ask? Speak up.
Unmuting at Stockport.
Oh, was that Stockport? Right. Ooh, because we've seen a couple in Manchester where they just said, oh, we got it all wrong. But arguably they haven't, because they're homeless and they're in difficult circumstances that might merit an award anyway. And then can you supersede that when we're not in a... when we're not in a pandemic anyway. That's a debate I'm yet to have with the tribunal system, but I will. Yeah, we'll have a chat about that out of the room, because there's technical bits that you might want to chuck at that. And I'll see you soon, no doubt, one way or the other. So yes, thank you. Where were we? Universal credit as a debt collection mechanism. All these things can automatically be deducted from your universal credit. And we see people where, although the rules say that they shouldn't be deducting more than 30% of the standard allowance, that can be exceeded in exceptional circumstances. And we see quite a lot of people where they're having 60, 70, 80% of that £324.84 a week deducted, because someone's thought that it's exceptional because they've got lots of debts. Never mind that they need to eat, or that they've got a 200 quid rent shortfall to pay. We see lots of people who are getting clobbered by these deductions. So again, even though they might be in the support group for employment and support allowance, or even though they might be earning 12 weeks worth, 12 hours at minimum wage, and own their own house, we have to be cautious about recommending people claim universal credit. We don't know what's round the corner to bite them, and we won't find out until it's too late to do anything about it. So again, be ye cautious. The deductions issue is as much a sting in the tail as whether or not a person will be better off. And I left this slide in when I was doing my notes on Tuesday, just to illustrate a couple of the things that went on. Because even now, universal credit are massively overworked. They've not managed to recruit enough people to deal with the claims. Those people that have been recruited are largely new. And there's these first two quotes. The first one's from the director of operations, I think he's called, the senior responsible owner, a bloke called Neil Coolin, who was very pleased that his system hadn't broke when 2.5 million people claimed universal credit inside a couple of weeks. But he was concerned that he didn't have the staff to deal with them. So what they did was they recruited everybody off the front line at the job centre, irrespective of the qualifications I fear. Because these days you've got a front line of people who were signing on 12 months ago, and a majority, I fear, aren't really up to the job of communicating with vulnerable people or experts what is quite a technical situation that they're seeing on someone's universal credit claim. And the last one is the truth about universal credit. You might hear about making work pay, you might hear about simplifying the system, but this is a quote from Ian Duncan Smith in a Mansion House speech many moons ago. And what he said that it was about supporting a flexible workforce, yada yada, short-term contracts, seasonal work. He didn't mention 0 hours contracts, but what universal credit was designed to do is flex to those pressures. People who earn something one week and not the next week, without too much mucking about. The legacy system's really bad at responding to those kind of problems. And universal credit was set up to facilitate gig workers and 0 hours workers, plain and simple. So don't believe that hype. Now, we've already mentioned that very early in the process of claiming universal credit, someone's required to enter into a claimant commitment. And I've already mentioned that some people aren't required to enter into a claimant commitment, although you might struggle to persuade Job Centre Plus of that fact. Now, many moons ago, I did a Freedom of Information request to look at what kind of people might not be required to agree a claimant commitment when they claimed universal credit. And what I got back was one paragraph tucked away in a training module that said some people might not have the capacity to enter into a claimant commitment. They might be street homeless. They might have severe mental health problems. One paragraph. But there was an entire page in the main handbook in red text that said everybody has to enter into a claimant commitment. And a lot of staff on the ground at Job Centre Plus are in that mantra of they've got to enter into a claimant commitment. But if someone's particularly vulnerable, they might not have to. Having that push-pull with Job Centre Plus is a good way of buying some people some time. Now we can see that there are 4 limbs to this claimant commitment: the work-related requirements. You've got to go for interviews, you've got to go for your work preparation, they can train you, you've got to look for work, you've got to be available for work on the day in most circumstances. If you give them a sick note, or if you get through a medical and you've only got limited capability for work, you only have to go to the interviews, you only have to go for work prep. If you're a carer, all this peels away. There's different categories that have to do different things, different categories of people that have to do different things. How old's your child? Do you have to do anything at all? All those things shift which bits of which work-related requirements a person might have imposed upon them. But one thing's for sure is if they don't keep up with the claimant commitments, then they're risking a sanction. And this is where another of my alarm bells have gone off, because last week I saw my first sanction decision again after the lockdown. They were being quite sensible. Even after the official lockdown stopped, I didn't hear about any sanction decisions for people, but I saw the first one last week, and it's clear that they're thinking about sanctioning people again. And again, the sharp edges are starting to show themselves, and we need to be alive to that. 2 kinds of sanctions: a low-level sanction if you don't go to an appointment or something similar. They'll sanction you until you go to your appointment and then for another week afterwards. Or these high-level sanctions is if you fail to get a job, if you fail to apply for a job, or if you give up work, then they'll hit you with a 12 or a 26-week sanction. And they can bolt together. So if you don't apply for 2 jobs that they've told you to within 6 months of each other, then you're going to end up with quite a substantial sanction. Now, the regulations say that they can sanction you for up to a year in some circumstances. But a couple of years ago, and I can't remember whether it was Amber Rudd or whether it was Dr. Coffey. Rob, can you remember who it was who dropped the 52-week sanctions? No, it was just about the transition. I suspect it might have been Amber Rudd actually. Said, don't worry, we won't sanction everyone for a year anymore. We're not that nasty. But they didn't remove the statutory authority to do so. So yeah, it's always worth bearing in mind that they could be nasty enough to reintroduce them on a whim, and it wouldn't happen. So we're looking at the finishing line now. I'm glad to say, come on, do your business. Because there are an awful lot of benefits left. Oh. Particularly council tax reduction. There's been a big break. A lot of people who've been claiming housing benefit, if they decide to claim universal credit, will lose the council tax reduction. And when they broke the link between council tax reduction and housing benefit, council tax arrears soared. So one of the things that I always advise my people, my advisors, to do is check whether someone's claimed council tax reduction. Again, child benefit pension, there's a lot of benefits still out there, some of them that are available to people of working age. So don't think universal credit is the be all and end all of the benefit system anymore, because there's still quite a lot of things available to us. And I just took a breath then, because I've just seen a slide that goes back. And we are, at this point, at the end of my presentation. And as ever, we want to throw it open for questions.
I've got a couple of comments, if that's all right.
That'd be great.
Because I had the, you might call it fortune or misfortune to be part of this exercise of consulting with stakeholders about the new campaign.
Yeah.
Which the headline news they had was, we calculate 50% of people will be better off on universal credit. Now, it doesn't take a genius to say, well, the alternative to that is 50% of people will either be on the same money or worse off on universal credit. And one thing that was flagged up repeatedly is, well, where's the proper advice coming from? Part of the campaign directs you to benefit checkers, which, as you say, are fine if you can work them.
Yeah.
They're fine if they're accurate, but they still won't tell you all the ins and outs of other things that can go wrong with the universal credit. I mean, another point that they built in to what they were saying was, yes, we've got this starting. It's going to be ramped up next year, and this is stage one of the push to universal credit. So it's just the next phase in the shift. And yes, I mean, welfare rights types were accusing them of trying to save money by getting people to move over before they had to be managed migrated. Yeah.
And now we're going to see the push to save the transitional protection. Plain and simple, I think. Any more? I'm watching the chat now. In which case, I'm simply going to say thank you. Hopefully this has been informative for some of you. I think it might have been a lesson in sucking eggs for some, looking at who's in here. But all the same, yeah, thank you. We'll see you next time.